The weight of the rope. The rope had been meant for ammunition. Private First Class Desmond Doss examined the coarse hemp fibers in the grey pre-dawn light, running his fingers along strands already showing wear from hauling crates of mortar rounds up the cliff face. Above them, Hacksaw Ridge loomed like a broken tooth against the Okinawan sky, its coral limestone face streaked with mud from the night's rain. The 77th Infantry Division had held the top for 3 days now, but holding ground and controlling it were different things entirely. "Doss, you sure about this rope?" Sergeant Miller's voice carried the weight of a man who'd seen too many improvised solutions fail under pressure. His left arm hung stiff at his side, wrapped in bandages that had once been white. The Japanese counterattack 2 nights ago had left him with shrapnel in his shoulder, but he'd refused evacuation. "That thing's been hauling 50-pound crates. You're talking about people." The question hung in the damp air between them. Around the makeshift staging area below the ridge, other members of their unit moved with the careful efficiency of men conserving energy for what lay ahead. The planned assault on the ridge's northern sector was supposed to begin at 0600, but intelligence reports suggested the Japanese had reinforced their cave positions overnight. What had been described as a mopping-up operation now looked like another frontal assault against an enemy who knew every inch of the coral maze above. Doss tested the rope's weight, feeling the slight give in fibers that had stretched under repeated loads. "It held those crates, Sergeant. The good Lord willing, it'll hold what we need it to hold." His voice carried the quiet certainty that had marked him since training, the same tone that had gotten him through months of harassment from men who couldn't understand why anyone would volunteer for combat without carrying a weapon. Private Johnson, crouched nearby, cleaning his rifle, looked up with barely concealed skepticism. "Doss, you planning to use that thing to pull wounded down from up there? You seen what's on top of that ridge? Place looks like the moon, if the moon was full of Japs with machine guns." Johnson had been one of the loudest voices questioning Doss's fitness during their stateside training, suggesting more than once that the conscientious objector might be better suited for kitchen duty or mail sorting. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. 3 months of island fighting had turned theoretical doubts into practical realities. Men who'd questioned Doss's courage had watched him move through artillery barrages to reach wounded soldiers, had seen him drag men to safety while mortar rounds exploded close enough to shower him with coral fragments. But questions remained. How could someone who wouldn't fight truly understand what they were going through? And what would happen when the shooting got so intense that even Doss's stubborn faith wouldn't be enough? Above them, the first sounds of morning contact drifted down from the ridge, scattered rifle shots and the distant chatter of a Japanese light machine gun. The enemy was awake and waiting. Captain Richards emerged from the command post tent, his face grim as he folded a radio message into his breast pocket. "Change of plans," Richards announced to the assembled squad leaders. "Division wants us to hold what we've got and consolidate. No attack this morning." He paused, scanning the faces of men who'd been psyching themselves up for another climb into hell. "Intelligence thinks they're planning something big. We're going to sit tight and see what develops." But even as he spoke, voices began calling from the top of the ridge. Faint at first, then growing more urgent as the wind shifted. "Medic! Medic!" The calls echoed off the coral face, bouncing between the cliff walls until they seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Doss stood slowly, the rope coiled in his hands. Above them, the ridge held wounded men from yesterday's fighting, Americans who'd been pinned down when the attack stalled, too close to enemy positions for a safe evacuation, too badly hurt to crawl back on their own. The calls for help had been going on intermittently since before dawn, a constant reminder of men left behind when the line had pulled back to consolidate. "Somebody's got to try," Doss said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the distant sound of gunfire. "I can hear them calling." Johnson shook his head. "Doss, you can't go back up there by yourself. The whole ridge is crawling with Japanese. You won't make it 10 yards. But Doss was already checking the knots on his medical kit. his hands steady despite the tremor that everyone could hear in his voice. The rope felt heavier now, weighted with possibility and responsibility. He looked up at the darkening sky, where rain clouds were building for another of Okinawa's sudden downpours. "Please, Lord," he whispered, his lips barely moving. "Help me get one more, just one more." The prayer became a rhythm in his mind as he secured the rope around the reinforced tree stump they'd been using as an anchor point. Around him, his fellow soldiers watched with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. This was the moment that would either vindicate their faith in the unarmed medic or confirm their worst fears about what happened when conscience collided with combat reality. The rope held the weight of more than wounded men. It carried the accumulated doubt and hope of every soldier who'd wondered whether courage without a weapon was really courage at all. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The ascent began in a silence broken only by the scrape of boots against coral and the distant pop of rifle fire from the Japanese positions. Doss pulled himself up the cliff face hand over hand, the rope cutting into his palms, despite the gloves he wore. Every few feet he paused to listen, trying to distinguish between the wind and the sound of movement in the enemy caves that honeycombed the ridge. 20 feet up, a bullet sparked off the rock face inches from his head, sending coral fragments into his eyes. He pressed himself against the cliff wall, waiting for his vision to clear and his heart to stop hammering. The Japanese had spotted him, or at least spotted movement. Whether they understood what he was trying to do remained unclear. Below, Sergeant Miller and the others watched through field glasses, helpless to provide covering fire without revealing their own positions. The ridge's geography worked against them. The Japanese held the high ground and knew every approach. What looked like open ground from below was actually a maze of interconnected firing positions, each one covering the others. "He's moving again," Johnson whispered, his voice tight with tension. "Crazy son of a... Sorry, Sarge, but this is insane." Miller lowered his field glasses, his jaw clenched. "Maybe, but listen." The calls for help had grown more urgent as word spread among the wounded that someone was coming. Voices that had been weak with blood loss and despair now carried desperate hope. "Medic, over here, Jesus, somebody's coming." The sound echoed off the coral walls, a chorus of American voices mixed with the occasional Japanese shout of alarm or command. When Doss finally pulled himself over the lip of the ridge, the landscape before him bore no resemblance to the terrain they'd crossed during the initial assault. Artillery had transformed the coral plateau into a moonscape of craters and shattered trees. Scattered equipment marked where the American advance had stalled and then retreated. Helmets, rifles, field packs, and medical supplies scattered across ground that no longer offered any meaningful cover. The first wounded man he found was Corporal Hayes, gut-shot and barely conscious, lying in a shell crater 40 yards from the cliff edge. Hayes had been one of the most vocal critics of Doss's presence in their unit, questioning whether the preacher boy would abandon them when the fighting got serious. Now, as Doss knelt beside him and began applying pressure to the wound, Hayes gripped his arm with desperate strength. "I'm sorry," Hayes gasped, his face grey with shock. "God, Doss, I'm so sorry. I thought you'd run." "Save your strength," Doss replied, his hands working quickly to stabilize the wound. "We're going to get you out of here." But even as he spoke, machine gun fire erupted from a hidden position to their left, forcing him to shield Hayes's body with his own as bullets whined overhead. The improvised evacuation system he'd envisioned, lowering men over the cliff edge on the ammunition rope, would require getting each wounded soldier to the drop point without being cut down by Japanese fire. The distance looked manageable from below, but up here, every yard was a killing field covered by multiple enemy positions. Getting Hayes to the cliff edge required a belly crawl through terrain that offered no cover. Every few yards, Doss stopped to listen for movement, trying to distinguish between wind and the sound of Japanese soldiers repositioning in their caves. when a flare suddenly burst overhead, illuminating the entire ridge in stark white light. Both men froze completely, Hayes's blood seeping between Doss's fingers as they waited in terrifying visibility for the light to fade. The rope system at the cliff edge was even more primitive than Doss had hoped. The ammunition rope was strong enough, but the improvised pulley, created by looping it around the reinforced tree stump, created friction that made controlling the descent difficult. As he rigged Hayes onto the makeshift stretcher and began lowering him into the darkness, the rope groaned audibly under the weight. Below, Miller and Johnson caught the stretcher as it reached bottom, their hands gentle as they transferred Hayes to a proper litter for the journey to the aid station. But even this small success felt fragile. The rope showed visible wear where it rubbed against the coral edge, and Japanese voices echoed from the caves, suggesting they were beginning to understand what was happening. "One down," Miller called softly up the cliff face, using their prearranged signal, but his voice carried doubt as well as encouragement. How many times could Doss make this journey before the rope failed or the Japanese decided to put a stop to his rescue operation? Above, Doss had already started moving toward the next voice calling for help. Private Wilson lay pinned under a fallen tree trunk, both legs mangled by shrapnel from the same artillery round that had dropped the tree. The trunk was too heavy to lift alone, but Wilson was bleeding too badly to wait for additional help that might never come. As Doss worked to free Wilson, using his medical kit as a fulcrum and leverage point, Japanese voices grew closer. They were moving through their tunnel system, repositioning to get a better angle on whatever was happening at the cliff edge. Time was running out, but Wilson's legs were finally free, and he was conscious enough to help with his own evacuation. The second descent went faster, but felt more dangerous. The rope stretched visibly under Wilson's weight, and halfway down, machine gun fire erupted from a position that commanded the cliff face. Bullets sparked off the coral around the descending stretcher, but Wilson reached the bottom safely, and Doss hauled the rope back up for the next wounded man. By the time he located the third casualty, a soldier from another platoon, unconscious with a head wound, the Japanese had begun probing attacks on the American positions below. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as automatic weapons chattered back and forth. Each burst of firing made Doss freeze in place, knowing that stray rounds could find him at any moment. But between the firefights, in the moments of relative quiet, he could still hear voices calling out in the darkness, American voices growing weaker as the night wore on, but still calling for help. Just one more, he whispered to himself as he prepared another stretcher. Please, Lord, just let me get one more. The third descent nearly cost them everything. Halfway down the cliff face, the rope began to unravel where it had been chafing against the coral edge, strands popping with small, sharp sounds that echoed off the rock walls. Below, Miller and Johnson watched in horror as the stretcher swayed dangerously, the unconscious soldier strapped to its frame completely helpless as his lifeline deteriorated strand by strand. "Hold on!" Miller called up, but there was nothing any of them could do except continue lowering and pray the remaining fibers would hold long enough. The stretcher reached bottom just as the rope finally parted completely, the severed end whipping back up the cliff face with a sound like a rifle shot. In the sudden silence that followed, Japanese voices called out from their hidden positions, and the distant sound of movement suggested they were repositioning for a coordinated response to whatever was happening at the American cliff edge. Doss stared down at the severed rope end in his hands, feeling the weight of impossible choices. The ammunition rope had been their only means of evacuation, and now it lay in pieces 60 feet below. Above him, wounded voices still called out from positions scattered across the ridge, American soldiers who would die without immediate medical attention. But Sergeant Miller was already organizing a solution. "Johnson, get that communication wire from the command post," he ordered. "Stevens, find every piece of rope, cord, or cable we've got in the supply dump. We're rigging another line." The improvised replacement took precious time to assemble. Communication wire spliced to tent rope, reinforced with parachute cord from emergency supply bundles. It was thinner than the ammunition rope and untested under the weight of wounded men, but it was all they had. As his squad worked to rig the new system, Miller kept glancing up at the ridge, wondering how long Doss could survive alone in that coral maze. Above, Doss had found another wounded soldier, Thompson, a squad leader who'd openly questioned his fitness for combat duty during their training at Fort Bragg. Thompson was unconscious, a head wound leaving him barely breathing, and moving him would require carrying dead weight across 40 yards of exposed ground to reach the cliff edge. By now, Doss had been on Hacksaw Ridge for over 4 hours. His water had run out after the second rescue. His medical supplies were nearly depleted, and every muscle in his body screamed with fatigue. The Japanese had stopped their random firing and settled into an ominous quiet that suggested they were planning something coordinated. In the distance, he could hear the sound of voices and equipment moving through their cave system. As he prepared to move Thompson, exhaustion began to overwhelm rational thought. His hands shook as he checked Thompson's pulse and rigged an improvised stretcher from a shelter half and 2 broken rifle stocks. The distance to the cliff edge looked impossible now, a journey across killing ground that he'd already crossed 6 times without being hit. How much longer could his luck hold? "One more, Lord," he whispered, the prayer becoming a mantra that blocked out fear and doubt. "Please, just let me get one more." The journey to the cliff edge became a nightmare of inches. Every few yards, Doss stopped to listen for movement, trying to gauge whether the Japanese were repositioning to cut him off. Thompson's breathing was so shallow it was barely detectable, and blood from his head wound left a trail that would be visible in daylight. If they didn't get him to medical attention soon, all the risk would be for nothing. When they finally reached the cliff edge, the new rope system looked painfully inadequate. The spliced line was less than half the thickness of the original ammunition rope, and the knots where different types of cord had been joined together created weak points that might fail under stress. But Thompson was dying, and dawn was still hours away. Doss closed his eyes and prayed again as he rigged Thompson onto the makeshift stretcher. "One more, Lord. Please, just let this rope hold for one more." The descent was agony. Every few feet, the rope stretched visibly, and the spliced joints groaned under Thompson's weight. Halfway down, one of the communication wire sections began to unwind, forcing Miller and Johnson to take up slack while praying the remaining line would hold. But Thompson reached the bottom alive, and hands immediately began working to stabilize him for transport to the aid station. Above, Doss hauled up the rope and stared out across the ridge. In the pale moonlight he could make out the shapes of other wounded men, some moving weakly, others ominously still. American soldiers who had followed orders to take the ridge and now lay scattered across ground that belonged to neither side, trapped between the Japanese cave positions and the cliff edge that represented their only hope of survival. The rational choice was clear. He'd already saved 4 men against impossible odds, and the improvised rope system was failing with each use. The Japanese were repositioning for what felt like a coordinated counterattack, and staying on the ridge any longer was probably suicide. Any reasonable person would declare the mission complete and begin his own evacuation before the enemy decided to end his rescue operation permanently. But in the darkness, American voices still called out, "Medic, over here, please, somebody help us." Doss checked his remaining medical supplies, 1 field dressing, a partial roll of bandages, and a morphine syringe with a cracked seal that might or might not be sterile. Enough to treat 1 more man, maybe 2 if their wounds were minor. The new rope looked like it might survive 1 or 2 more descents before the spliced joints failed completely. He thought about the aid station below, where Dr. Patterson would be working through the night to save the men he'd already sent down. 4 American soldiers who would live because he'd climbed this cliff with an ammunition rope and enough stubborn faith to ignore the impossibility of what he was attempting. But he could still hear voices in the darkness, growing weaker as the hours passed. "Just one more," he whispered, the words becoming a prayer that blocked out everything else. The Japanese voices in their caves, the sound of his own breathing, the rational voice in his head that insisted he'd done enough. One more. Just one more. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The 5th man Doss found was dying. Private Martinez lay in a shell crater near the center of the ridge, gut-shot and barely conscious, his uniform soaked with blood that looked black in the moonlight. He was young, maybe 19, and when he saw Doss approaching, his eyes filled with desperate hope that made the medic's chest tighten with responsibility and fear. "Am I going home?" Martinez whispered, his voice so weak Doss had to lean close to hear him. "My mama. She's going to be so worried." Doss knelt beside him, his hands working quickly to assess the wounds. The bullet had entered Martinez's abdomen below the ribs, and without immediate surgery he would bleed to death long before dawn. But moving him might finish what the Japanese bullet had started, and the improvised rope system had already shown signs of failing under lighter loads. "We're going to try," Doss replied, applying pressure to the wound with his last field dressing. "You just stay with me, son. Don't you go to sleep." But even as he worked, the rational part of his mind calculated the odds. Martinez needed surgery within the hour, and the journey to the cliff edge would require carrying dead weight across 50 yards of exposed ground. The Japanese had been quiet for too long, and their silence suggested they were planning something that would make his previous rescues look simple by comparison. As if summoned by his thoughts, voices began calling out from the enemy positions, not the random shouts he'd been hearing all night, but coordinated commands that suggested organized movement. They were coming for him, and Martinez would slow him down just enough to ensure that neither of them made it off the ridge alive. The choice crystallized with brutal clarity: abandon Martinez and save himself, or stay and try to save one more man at the cost of both their lives. It was the moment that would later be compressed into clean sentences in after-action reports, the human reality reduced to statistics and recommendations. But lived from the inside, crouched in a shell crater with a dying teenager, it felt like the weight of the entire war pressing down on his shoulders. "Please, Lord," Doss whispered, his hands continuing to work even as his mind struggled with impossible mathematics. "Show me what to do." Martinez's eyes fluttered closed, then opened again with visible effort. "I can't feel my legs," he said quietly. "Something's wrong with my legs." Doss checked quickly and felt his heart sink. The bullet had done more damage than he'd initially realized, probably severing the spinal cord. Even if they got Martinez to surgery immediately, he would never walk again, and the bleeding was getting worse, despite pressure on the wound. But Martinez was looking at him with the absolute trust that wounded men gave to their medics, the faith that someone would try to save them, no matter how bad things got. It was a trust Doss had carried through months of island fighting, the knowledge that men depended on him in ways that went beyond medical training or military doctrine. "You stay with me," Doss said again, rigging his belt as an improvised stretcher handle. "We're going home, son. Both of us." The journey to the cliff edge became a race against time and enemy movement. Halfway across the open ground, Japanese voices grew loud enough to suggest they were moving through their tunnel system toward the cliff face. Doss could hear equipment rattling and the sound of boots on coral, the unmistakable noise of soldiers positioning for an assault. Martinez drifted in and out of consciousness, his weight growing heavier as shock set in. Twice, Doss had to stop and check for a pulse, terrified that he was dragging a dead man across the ridge while living soldiers waited for help he could no longer provide. But Martinez's heart kept beating, and his breathing, though shallow, continued. When they finally reached the cliff edge, the improvised rope system looked even less reliable than before. The communication wire had stretched under previous loads, and several of the splice points showed signs of separation. Miller's voice drifted up from below, tight with concern. "Doss, that line's not going to hold much longer. This might need to be the last one." The last one. The words carried the weight of all the voices still calling out in the darkness, American soldiers who would die if he stopped now. But the rope was failing. The Japanese were positioning for an attack, and Martinez needed surgery that was already probably too late to save him. Doss rigged Martinez onto the stretcher with extra care, using his own belt to secure the wounded man's torso and prevent him from sliding out if the stretcher tilted during descent. As he worked, Martinez opened his eyes one more time. "Tell my mama I wasn't scared," he whispered. "Tell her I was brave." "You tell her yourself," Doss replied, but his voice broke on the words. "You're going to be fine." The descent began in relative quiet, but halfway down, the rope system began to fail catastrophically. The communication wire snapped with a sound like a gunshot, transferring Martinez's full weight to the thinner parachute cord that formed the backup line. The cord stretched visibly, and Doss could hear Miller and Johnson shouting warnings from below as the splice points began to separate. Above them, Japanese voices erupted in coordinated shouts, and muzzle flashes lit up the cliff face as automatic weapons opened fire. They had finally decided to end his rescue operation, and bullets sparked off the coral around the descending stretcher as Martinez hung helpless in the darkness. The parachute cord held just long enough. Martinez reached the bottom as the final splice point failed, the rope parting with a snap that sent the broken end whipping back up the cliff face. But he was alive, and hands immediately began working to stabilize him for the journey to Dr. Patterson's aid station. Alone on the ridge, Doss stared at the severed rope in his hands. In the distance, wounded voices still called out for help, but the mathematics had finally become impossible. Without a rope, without medical supplies, and with Japanese soldiers moving to cut off his position, continuing the rescue operation would accomplish nothing except adding his own body to the casualty count. But as he prepared to find an alternative route down the cliff face, Martinez's words echoed in his mind, "Tell my mama I was brave." The trust in that dying boy's eyes, the absolute faith that someone would try to save him no matter the cost. And in the darkness, other voices continued calling, "Medic, please! Somebody help us!" Doss closed his eyes and prayed one more time, the words becoming a rhythm that blocked out gunfire and enemy voices and the rational fear that had kept him alive through months of combat. "Just one more, Lord, please, just let me find a way to get one more." The secret that Doss never shared, the truth that wouldn't appear in any after-action report or citation, was how close he came to breaking that night on Hacksaw Ridge. After the rope failed and Martinez was lowered to safety, Doss had crouched alone at the cliff edge, his hands shaking uncontrollably as the weight of accumulated terror finally caught up with him. For nearly 6 hours, he had moved through a landscape of violence that should have been impossible to survive, sustained by prayer and stubborn determination. But now, with Japanese voices growing closer and no way to continue the evacuation, something inside him began to crack. He thought about Private Johnson's words from that morning, "You won't make it 10 yards." About Sergeant Miller's doubt when he'd examined the ammunition rope. About all the times during training when fellow soldiers had questioned whether his conscience was really courage or just fear disguised as principle. Maybe they had been right. Maybe what he'd done tonight was just elaborate suicide, the actions of someone too scared to admit he didn't belong in combat. In the darkness above, wounded voices still called out, "Medic, over here, don't leave us!" But without rope, without medical supplies, without any means of evacuation, what could he possibly accomplish except adding his own name to the casualty list? For the first time since climbing the cliff face, Doss seriously considered finding a way down and declaring the mission complete. 5 men saved against impossible odds was already more than anyone had a right to expect. Dr. Patterson would be working through the night to stabilize the wounded he'd already sent down. Martinez might live, might even see his mother again. Hayes, Wilson, Thompson, all of them breathing because he'd climbed this ridge with an ammunition rope and enough faith to ignore the mathematics of survival. But then he heard something that changed everything, a voice calling out in pain that wasn't asking for a medic. It was asking for God. "Please, God," the voice echoed across the ridge. "Please don't let me die alone up here." The words hit Doss like a physical blow, cutting through his exhaustion and fear. This wasn't about military doctrine or medical training or proving his courage to men who had questioned his fitness for combat. This was about something more basic, the simple human inability to walk away from someone crying out in the darkness. He began moving toward the voice without any clear plan, crawling across ground he could barely see, following sound more than sight. The wounded soldier turned out to be another teenager. They were all so young, lying next to the entrance of a Japanese cave that had been collapsed by artillery. His legs were pinned under fallen coral, and he'd been calling for help since before dawn. "What's your name, son?" Doss whispered as he knelt beside him. "Peterson," the boy replied. "Jimmy Peterson." "From Nebraska. I don't want to die here, medic. I want to go home." Peterson's legs weren't just pinned, they were crushed. Even with proper equipment and multiple stretcher bearers, moving him would require careful excavation that might take hours. And without rope, there was no way to get him down the cliff, even if Doss could free him from the coral. But as Doss worked to clear debris from around Peterson's trapped legs, an idea began forming. The collapsed cave entrance created a natural shelter, invisible from most Japanese positions and protected from direct fire. If he could stabilize Peterson and the other wounded men, he could still hear calling out they might survive until morning brought reinforcements and proper evacuation equipment. It wasn't rescue in any conventional sense. It was triage on an impossible scale, using the last of his medical knowledge to keep wounded men alive a few hours longer in hope that dawn would bring help. But it was something, a way to honor the trust in Peterson's voice when he'd asked God not to let him die alone. The next 4 hours became a blur of crawling movement between scattered wounded, using his remaining medical supplies to stop bleeding and treat shock, whispering reassurances to men who had given up hope of seeing sunrise. Some of the soldiers he found were already dead, and he closed their eyes and whispered brief prayers before moving on to the next voice, calling out in the darkness. By the time the eastern horizon began to show the first pale hint of dawn, Doss had located and stabilized 6 more wounded men. None of them could be moved without proper equipment, but all of them were alive, and all of them now knew they weren't alone on that coral ridge. Someone had heard their voices and crawled through enemy territory to find them. When the relief column finally arrived, a full platoon with stretcher bearers and proper rope equipment, they found Doss sitting beside Peterson, both of them unconscious from exhaustion. Around them, in a rough perimeter, lay the other wounded men he'd found and stabilized, each one marked with a small cross torn from the pages of his pocket Bible so the rescue teams could find them quickly. The official count would list 11 men evacuated from Hacksaw Ridge during the night of May 4-5, 1945. The citation would mention extraordinary courage under fire and life-saving medical treatment provided in enemy territory. But the numbers and citations would never capture what Doss carried with him down that cliff face. The weight of voices calling out in darkness, the trust in young eyes that had looked to him for salvation, and the terrible knowledge of how close he'd come to walking away. Years later, when people asked him about that night, Doss would always pause before answering. He would remember Martinez asking him to tell his mother he wasn't scared, and Peterson's plea not to die alone, and the sound of his own voice whispering prayers in the darkness while Japanese soldiers moved through caves just yards away. But mostly, he would remember the rope, how it had held just long enough to save the men who could be saved, and how its breaking had forced him to discover that rescue came in many forms. Sometimes it was dramatic evacuation under fire. Sometimes it was just staying with someone, so they didn't have to face their fear alone. The rope had frayed and failed, but something stronger had held through that long night on the ridge. Something that didn't show up in after-action reports or medal citations, but lived on in the memories of men who had heard a voice answering when they called out to God in their darkest hour. The official after-action report filed by Captain Richards was 3 pages of military precision: grid coordinates, casualty numbers, enemy contact timelines, and recommendations for future operations. Private First Class Desmond Doss was mentioned in paragraph 7 as having performed medical duties under enemy fire, resulting in the successful evacuation of multiple wounded personnel. The bureaucratic language captured none of the human reality: the weight of bodies on improvised stretchers, the sound of prayers whispered between explosions, the moment when fraying rope became the difference between life and death. Dr. Patterson worked through the night at the aid station, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as wounded men arrived from the ridge. Hayes, gut-shot but stable. Wilson with his mangled legs, conscious and asking for morphine. Thompson with his head wound, still unconscious but breathing steadily. Martinez, barely alive, requiring immediate surgery that might save his life but couldn't restore the use of his legs. By morning, the tally was 11 men evacuated, 9 of whom would survive their wounds. Martinez would spend 8 months in military hospitals before being discharged to a wheelchair and a Medal of Honor ceremony he was too weak to attend. Peterson from Nebraska would keep his legs, but walk with a permanent limp that made him think of coral cliffs every rainy day for the rest of his life. But there was another count, one that didn't appear in any official record. The number of times those 11 men would tell their children and grandchildren about the medic who wouldn't carry a weapon but climbed a rope into hell to bring them home. The stories would change over decades, gaining mythic weight, but they would always include the sound of a voice answering when they called for help in the darkness. Doss himself remembered fragments more than narratives. The texture of hemp rope cutting into his palms, the weight of Thompson's unconscious body during the crawl to the cliff edge, Martinez asking him to tell his mother he wasn't scared, Peterson's voice pleading with God not to let him die alone. These moments lived in his body as much as his memory. Phantom rope burn that flared up during thunderstorms, a tendency to count wounded in his sleep, the way his hands trembled slightly whenever he heard someone call for help. The first nightmare came 3 weeks later, during what was supposed to be a rest period behind the lines. Doss woke to the sound of his own voice calling out, "Just one more," a prayer that had become a promise that had become a weight he would carry for the rest of his life. The medics in his own unit started watching him carefully, noting the signs they'd learned to recognize in men who'd stayed too long in forward positions. But there was something else that stayed with him, something that never made it into the nightmares or the tremor in his hands. It was the memory of moments when his faith hadn't felt like faith at all, but like the simple inability to walk away from voices calling out in darkness. When courage had felt less like choice than compulsion, the way a rope holds weight not through decision but through the basic integrity of its fibers. 6 months after Hacksaw Ridge, Doss was invalided home with wounds that weren't visible on X-rays. The Army doctors documented hearing loss from artillery exposure, minor malnutrition and exhaustion syndrome. They missed the deeper injuries, the way rain on a roof could bring back the sound of wounded voices, or how the smell of hemp rope at a construction site could make him stop breathing for several seconds. The Medal of Honor ceremony took place at the White House on a clear October afternoon. President Truman spoke about extraordinary heroism and service beyond the call of duty, his words carrying across a crowd of reporters and dignitaries who had gathered to witness history. But Doss found himself thinking about Peterson, still recovering in a Nebraska hospital, and Martinez, learning to navigate the world from a wheelchair. The real weight of that night on the ridge wasn't in the medal or the headlines. It lived in the knowledge that 11 families had received different telegrams because one man with a rope and stubborn faith had refused to accept that some situations were impossible. It lived in the memory of voices calling out in darkness and someone answering, "I'm coming, hold on, just one more." Years later, when his own sons asked him about the war, Doss would pause for a long time before answering. He would tell them about the rope, how it had held just long enough to save the men who could be saved. He would talk about prayer as a practical tool, like a field dressing or a stretcher, something you used when you had run out of everything else. But he wouldn't tell them about the nightmares, or the way his hands still shook when it rained, or how he sometimes woke up counting wounded men in his sleep. Those were weights that belonged to him alone, carried by someone who had learned that heroism wasn't about being unafraid. It was about answering when someone called for help, even when every rational voice insisted the situation was hopeless. The rope had broken, but something stronger had held, something that lived on in hospital wards and family dinners, in children who grew up knowing their fathers had come home from a coral ridge because someone refused to leave them behind. Something that didn't require medals or ceremonies, but lived quietly in the space between darkness and dawn, where voices called out and someone always answered, "I'm coming, hold on, just one more." The legend would grow over decades, gaining weight and mythic power, becoming larger than the man who lived it. But the real story remained smaller and more human. The memory of hemp rope cutting into burned palms, the sound of wounded voices in darkness, and the simple, stubborn refusal to walk away when someone needed help. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.